Assalamualaikum. This is part 2 of the lecture How to Critically Analyze English Poetry. In the previous lecture, I gave you 6 points to look for in a poem. The first one was content, then structure, then rhyme, rhythm and meter, style, and the last of all, figures of speech. Today we are going to discuss those 6 points one by one. So the first point is content. In the content, you need to look at the title, if a title is given or not. Most of the time, the poems which are given in exam, they do not have a title, or maybe a lot of shorter poems do not come with a title. But if a title is given, you need to understand its relevance and its importance. You need to understand why the poet has selected a certain title to be given to that poem. For example, you have read a poem called Poison Tree in your BA course. So why the poet wanted it to be titled as a poison tree? Because it's an extended metaphor, and the whole poem is about how a certain feeling, especially of envy and hatred, it turns you into a person who is very poisonous. So the title is quite relevant, and it somehow encompasses the whole theme of the poem. But sometimes the poems do not come with a title, and that is quite all right, because most of the time what it does is that it colors your interpretation of the poem. So you should not let that happen. You should just take it as a point. If the title is given, well and good, try to understand its relevance, and if not, obviously your focus is going to be on the poem. The second thing that comes under content is the themes which are given in the poem. You need to understand whether only one theme is given or whether there are multiple themes, or if there is a shift from one theme to another. It especially happens in sonnets, where you start with a certain theme, there is a certain problem, and then the resolution comes towards the end. Sometimes after self-reflection, and sometimes there's an external intervention, and then you come up with a solution. So you need to understand what the themes are, and sometimes there's an interwoven theme. You are talking about more than one theme in a same poem. So maybe you're talking about exploitation and poverty and war all together in one poem. So you need to understand how many themes are being stated. Then obviously the setting. Setting is the place and the time of the poem. So you need to understand when a certain poem was written and whether it was placed in a certain setting or not. In a setting, we can roughly label it as rural setting or urban setting, country setting. It's an abstract setting, etc. Sometimes a universal. The poet does not tell you where he's sitting and whether he wants it to be specific to that setting or not. With reference to when it was written, sometimes the poems are era specific. So you're talking about a certain historical or a political event that happened, and the poem is actually based on that. So that is why the when is important. So you need to understand what exactly was happening at that time around the poet, which actually forced him to write the poem. Then the other thing is the narrator. Narrator is the person talking to you in the poem. So it is the reader response that you get towards the poem. Sometimes it is very explicit. I is used, that is the first person pronoun. So you need to understand whether the poet is himself narrating the poem or whether he is having another character within the poem. For example, when Wordsworth says I, most of the time it is Wordsworth himself. But when Robert Browning says I, it can be Robert Browning himself or one of his characters that he used in a dramatic monologue. Then the last one is the mood of the poem. Mood is actually the overall feeling that you get after you read the poem. So it might be somber, serious, joyous, ironic, satirical. It just depends on the vocabulary that is being used in the poem. Generally, if it is a positive vocabulary having positive connotations, so you are going to have a joyous poem. If it is more somber, lacks color, or lacks that joy in the vocabulary, obviously it's somber and more serious. Then obviously we move to the next one, which is called the structure. The structure is obviously how is your poem made up. So the first thing is to decide what kind of poem is it, whether it's dramatic. Under dramatic, you might have a poem which is tragic or comic or historic romance, or even monologues can come under dramatic. Dramatic is when you have a drama going on, when you have a certain situation going on and you have a beginning, middle and end. Then you can have a narrative. Narrative you have epics and ballads. You can have satire, which is most evident in mock epic, or you can have lyric. Under lyric, you have different types of poems. You have odes and sonnets, you have ballads, you have free verse, etc. And most of the time, the poems that you get in your exam come from the last category. They are lyrical poems, which can be most of the time sonnets or odes, because of the time restraint and the constraint that you have in the paper. And after that, obviously, you need to understand how a poem is made up. The basics unit or the basic structural unit of a poem is a stanza. So stanza is made up of lines, and depending on the number of lines, the stanza changes from one to another. So the basic unit is couplet. Couplet has two lines, as the name suggests. It's a couple of lines, and it can be in varying meters, but basically you have two types of couplets. One is a heroic couplet and the other one is just simple couplet. In a heroic couplet you have the last two lines rhyming together. So here obviously I have selected a stanza which is made up of couplets. So there are 6 lines, but the 6 lines are actually made up of 3 couplets: dressed, expressed, breeze, trees, creep, sleep. So all the last lines, the last words, they rhyme together, and you might call it a poem which is made up of couplets. Then comes terza rima. As the name suggests, it is a stanza comprising of 3 lines, and most of the lines have a interlocking rhyme scheme. So you might have the first stanza going A B A, and the next one would be B C B, and C D C, and D E D, and so on. The example given here is by Robert Frost. I have been acquainted with the night, and the people who have taken BA literature, they are already familiar with the poem. The rest can actually Google it up and read it, because it's one of the best examples of using terza rima in poetry. So if you look at the last 3 words, night, rain, and light, so you have a similar rhyme scheme going on between night and light, and then rain is somehow a different word in the center. So it makes up the rhyme scheme as A, B, A. And the next one is obviously from 3 to we move 4 lines, which is called a quatrain. The word has been derived from quata. Quata means 4. So it's a stanza which is made up of 4 lines, a very common one in other poetry or other language poetry also. We have it in Urdu called rubai, and we have it in Persian as well, also called rubai. And we have people like Allama Iqbal and Umar Khayyam, which have perfected this type of poetry. You might have poems which are of 4 lines, which is called a rubai. So that's a complete thought structure over there. But here obviously you can have a poem which is made up of quatrains. So you might have a poem which has 3 or 4 or 5 quatrains. So a quatrain is a 4-line stanza, and usually it has a regular rhyme scheme. You might have the last 4 words rhyming together, or you might have it alternate rhyming, like A A B B. If you look at the stanza given here, day, li, way, me. So day rhymes with way and li rhymes with me. So it's A B A B over here. The next most common type of poetry or the structure that we have is blank verse. Blank verse actually means having no structure. So it's a set of lines which can go from 6 lines to 600 lines, and it is usually has some internal rhyming going on. Eliot is known to have written in blank verse. Wordsworth himself has written a lot of blank verse. Shakespeare and Marlowe also. So these lines have some internal rhyme scheme going on. So you have a sing-song effect when you read it, but somehow it does not have a very strict ending rhyme scheme, which is called the external rhyme scheme. We do not have lines ending on the same rhyme in these poems. And the last one is sonnet. Sonnet obviously is the most important, because most of the time, like out of 180% of the time, you have sonnets which you need to do in exams. And a sonnet is basically a poem which is made up of 14 lines, and the 14 lines are divided into 8 plus 6. So you usually have top 8 lines which are called an octave, and the last 6 lines which are called a sestet. Octave comes from the word octa. Octa also means 8. And this type of poetry, or these type of poems, were basically written by Patriarch, which was an Italian poet, and he was the one who made it famous. And his structure was 8 plus 6. And then later Shakespeare experimented with the kind, and he had another kind of sonnet called the Shakespearean Sonnet. Now you need to understand the difference between a Patriarchal sonnet and a Shakespearean sonnet. The lines remain 14, but how they are structured, there's a little bit of difference. As far as the Patriarchal sonnet is concerned, you have 8 plus 6. Within 8, you might have 2 quatrains, which means 4 plus 4. And the last one, this is a set, means that you might have 2 stanzas of 3 lines each. And the rhyme scheme somehow is regular also. I've taken this sonnet called London 1802, written by William Wordsworth, And if you look here, the first 8 lines are structured in 4 plus 4 lines. So if you look at the rhyme scheme, hour, fen, pen, bower, so it's A, B, B, A, and then dower, men, again, power, it's A, B, B, A. So it's quite regular. And then the last 6 lines go apart, see, free, way, heart, lay. So it's C, D, D, E, C, E. But more important than that is to understand that within a sonnet, in the first 8 lines, you are presented or introduced to the theme of the poem, and in some time it is called the problem of the poem also. And in the 9th line, which is also called the volta of the sonnet, the change happens. And in the susset that follows, obviously you come up with the solution to the problem. So in a patriarchal sonnet, the first 8 lines present the problem, and the last 6 lines they present the solution. Most of the times the solution comes from self-reflection. The poet thinks within and he tries to come up with an answer, and sometimes you get the answer from the outside. And the next type of sonnet is the Shakespearean sonnet. Shakespeare has written a lot of sonnets, I think more than 150, but he somehow changed the structure a little. Instead of 8 plus 6, he said 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 2. So you actually have a sonnet which is made up of 3 quatrains and then a rhymed couplet at the end. So if you look at the last 2 lines of the sonnet, rare and compare, rare rhymes with compare, whereas in the previous sonnet, the last 2 lines, they do not rhyme together. I'll just show you. If you look here, heart does not rhyme with lay, whereas in Shakespearean sonnet, rare rhymes with compare. So that is the main difference. But other than that, as far as the problem is concerned, the quatrains, they present the problem, and obviously the solution comes towards the end. So we are going to stop here, and we are going to continue with the third part of the lecture later.